So let's talk about it. So this is a across the. I'm going to share an activity that's very active across the United States, of which the transplant community is part of, and it's and I'm part of. And I thought it would be very relevant, in this modern era for you to see this and share this. It's partly what we're asked to do. And so we are part of a radiation injury treatment network. This was set up a number of years ago, and but um, every 2 years we have a retraining or a new meeting, a biannual meeting, and I just got back from that 2 weeks ago. This is a slide. I actually gave a talk about this over 10 years ago. This is sort of like there's a famous movie called Dr. Strangelove, and so it's like what happens if you have a nuclear event. Well, there is a radiation response group that is across the country, and when I give this talk, it is public service. I've given it to our entire hospital. I've given it to other hospitals because it's a sense of that something we never want to have to do and never want to know about, but it's something that if something ever happens, it's the transplant physicians across the world are going to be called upon to, help out. And I'm going to say this is the presentation I was just the talk I was just at in July 9th to 10th. And when I sat there listening to this, I said I've already created a talk on cell therapy for solid tumors, and I created a myeloma um, CAR T versus bispecific talk. But I thought this was far more important to share with you, and so we could just be aware of this activity. And so this is some of just these slides are just some of the talks we had, but it's the people. This is Washington D.C. Alexandria, Virginia is right across the river. But we have NATO, we have the American Burn Association, we have all a variety of the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. That is a definitely a Capitol Hill activity. The site of the disaster local, there's a local groups, there's exercises taking place in the United States for a mass casualty institute, full scale exercises they're given presentations on. What do you do? How do you deliver? How do you prepare yourself for disaster? What about antimicrobials? What diagnostics will you have and what will you need? And also, how do we give blood to people who need it? And I'm going to explain a lot of this. I'll also finally comment that the keynote speaker was basically final was the who ended this conference was the hematologist from Kiev. He was there at Chernobyl, helping through the radiation accident at Chernobyl, and he's right now is talking about with the middle of the Russian-Ukrainian war. What would ever happen if there is a nuclear events occur, and could they be prepared for it? I will say his words were sobering. I distinctly said, if 1,000 people come, we can handle it. If 10,000 people come, we will be overwhelmed. And so what I want to do is talk about what the radiation injury network is in the United States, various scenarios that have been developed for which we should be prepared for, a little bit about biology and dosimetry and the radiation syndrome, and then what we can do. So this is one of my own slides. I said, what can radiation do for you? Well, obviously, it can make you a superhero like the Hulk or Fantastic Four or Spider-Man, or it could be a nuclear sub. This I actually invited to. I got to be a VIP participant in the launch of the USS Oregon. This is back on the East Coast, and I got an invite for the work that I do here. That was exciting. But nuclear power subs that nuclear power can be harnessed effectively. But what is written? Radiation Injury Network, a group of voluntary hospitals across the United States. Canada is now participating in written, and it's to be focused that you can be prepared to the best possible for any large-scale radiologic incident. And the recognition, though, is this is not a network for immediate reaction to casualties in your area. This is a national effort that you will be able to transport patients for immediately across the country. And the Air Force evacuation system would help to deliver patients with radiation injury to all of the participating hospitals. And you have to cover the country because events could occur anywhere. So you have to be prepared for casualties. You have to be able to provide supportive care. You have to be able to also, the key is to collect data and identify, are there ever patients that could be a candidate for transplants? We're the ones that know how to do it. And so the mission, the actual mission statement is, we will be prepared to treat radiation syndrome casualties from a distant site if there's a mass casualty disaster. Thus, we're not first responders. We're not there to do trauma care. It's going to be, the surge is not going to be in the first day, but it's going to be 7 to 10 days after an incident that you can expect that patients will be arrive for therapy, for treatment. And this is now integrated, incredibly well integrated in the United States into the National Disaster Medical System. So I was saying, just for you, if you guys were ever curious, this is a fun slide. I punched up written on the web. And what you have is you have a heavy metal band called Razors in the Night. You can find them, or you can find the German band called Written Ditten, but you also can find the Radiation Injury Treatment Network. And so what are they doing for everybody? They're creating standard operating procedures. They are working really hard. All those national agencies, both governmental and non-governmental, are working together and creating policies and making them available to everybody so that they could actually absorb them. They've trained over 20,000 people in the last 15 years. I've done pretty every 2 years as I'm involved in these training programs. They have exercises. We have an exercise every year. Sometimes it's on site, sometimes it's a tabletop, where they will give us a scenario and we have to say, how fast can we move and make this happen? Now, honestly, at a hospital level, you'll sit back and say, wow, if something happened 500 miles away, 1,000 miles away, of course, we'll use our hospitals. But our hospitals are usually filled at 90%. And a patient is a patient. And so we have to also be fair and honest. Yes, we want to help our fellow citizens, but we also are already taking care of citizens. And so how do we actually mobilize an emergency event if we need it? So I was there in 2005 for the very first organization meeting. I represented a lot of the West, and I don't know why I got invited, but I did. So, but we got this certificate of appreciation for OHSU that we were, one of the founding institutions. So I've been doing this for a long time. But again, everyone sort of says it's a waste of time. Well, it's a waste of time. If my lifetime it's a waste of time, that will be time be well spent. What we never want to do is have to actually activate this activity. These are, again, our hospitals, and they are continuing to crew hospitals based on population. And Orlando is just added. Florida is a very populated state, but you'll notice the West is pretty wide open. These are our hospitals, and each of the hospitals have a set of different responsibilities that one would be prepared for. So they are active. This is the 5-year plan that they presented data on, that they want to increase the number of hospitals. You can see we are getting, like Boise, Idaho, New Mexico. We're adding more places in the West Coast, California, stretching out to Hawaii. So they are looking to expand and fill in the gaps. They also want to make more people aware of it. That's partly why I decided I should do this. I want to make you aware of what we're doing. So, if it's not happening, if such an activity is not happening in Thailand, maybe we can help get it started. We want to be able to collaborate. The federal government is involved, the Department of Defense, the Congress and the executive branch uses the Department of Health and Human Services and the VA system. And ultimately, part of it is to make sure that hospitals are prepared if we need it. So what they've done is they've created um, toolkits. They've created, and these are available, these exercises. You can go online and download them, and you can run an exercise yourself. Are we prepared to deal with trauma? Are we prepared to deal with burn? Are we able to really handle these events when they happen? What about the families? They talk about there'll be a lot of John Does that arrive. John Doe is like an anonymous person. Potentially, if in these disasters occur, you could have children separated from parents. How do you like handle them? What do you do to like coordinate, recombining, individuals in the future? These are all problems, and these are all exercises that we've been faced with. They also have now made available in the electronic record. You can go online through written. Epic owns about 60 or 70% of the healthcare, academic healthcare in most of the hospitals in the United States. They've now created radiation injury sets that you can download into Epic that'll immediately start to set up how do we respond to an event, and that so rather than having to think about it, it's done for you so you don't waste time. We are seeing it growth. You can see this is where we started. The few centers that we were back there in 2006, but it just has grown. And we have about nationwide, it's about 70. They think they would love to get to 120 hospitals. Part of it is training and education. They've now trained 20,000 people. They have exercises that we run locally, like the 20 or 30 or 40 of you, if I took attendance, I could report that we added 30 or 20 or 30 or 40 people more to the training. We keep mandatory in the United States. When I give grand rounds, it is a mandatory signature so people can say I've been trained, and it's because the US government keeps track of this. They want to know how effective we are at spreading a message. As I said, they have exercises every single year. Some are full scale, some are tabletop, some are regional. Like they'll put 5 centers together and say, online, you're doing this, and here's your scenario. And it runs out. Like we have a 2 to 3 hour block of time, and it runs out in real time while we're rapidly contacting our administrators. How many emergency beds? Go to our pharmacy. How many doses of GSCF do we have in the pharmacy at this moment? But these are the kind of things that we would be faced with. So this is all about dealing with this in that hematologists are going to be critical. Surgeons, emergency room physicians, they're going to be there at the first moment. But when somebody's sick in the hospital with a radiation injury, hematologists will take over because we know how to deal with the patients who get high dose radiation and toxicity. So what are the scenarios? Well, these are the scenarios of things that we would anticipate. It could be a single source of a radioactive, a loss of a radioactive accident. I'm sorry, a loss of a radioactive source. So this is famous in Brazil called Guyana. There was a radiation therapy program that went broke, and they left it open. And there was these people like found this shiny blue metal, and they took it home. And there was a number of people who died because they took this shiny blue metal because it was not protected. It was a cesium source that led to a lot of toxicity. You could have Chernobyl, like a release of radioactive gas, and you could also see the number of deaths that could be happen. A dispersal device is basically a dirty bomb. So the number of actual deaths that would occur from a dirty bomb is actually felt to be small. But on the other hand, the chaos that comes from a dirty bomb, and I'll explain what that is, versus now we get into an open source radioactive device. So this example is if you're on, like you have a metro in you have a metro. What people could do is underneath the seat, someone could leave a radioactive source that's, high gamma radiation. People come in, sit down on that chair for 15 or 20 minutes, and they're exposed. And so you can have a very significant amount of toxicity. Obviously, the improvised nuclear device, that's the terrorist activity. And then the military grade is what the countries have. And to be honest, people don't anticipate that the military grade nuclear devices will be used, but that's where you could see millions of deaths. The US government, when we were there in 2006 or 2005, they had actually set up a workbook for threat planning. And these are the 15, topics of the that were in the workbook. You could see a cyber attack was one of them, but a 10 kiloton improvised nuclear device was one. That was what the Ingalls explained that. I think I can explain why. And then the dirty bomb, the radiologic dispersal devices. The others are nerve agents, potentially biologic warfare, and also things like earthquakes and hurricanes, as well as, what to do in the event of an epidemic like pandemic influenza. The workbook in preparing for COVID actually was defined, almost 20 years before the COVID actually hit, at least by the US, and we still weren't prepared. Now, this is a scary slide. So this came from the one of the nuclear reporting agencies. They were identifying, since this is either criminal activities or identifications where either high energy uranium or plutonium was either disappeared or was found to be in the wrong hands. And it looks like by year, maybe 10 events. This is across the world, but still, there's over close to 500 different events over a 20-year period. And that's what's reported. Things that were lost in the past. A lot of people, when talk about when the Soviet Union broke up, a lot of these, the nuclear plants in the Siberia, Kazakhstan, they were abandoned, and who knows what happened to a lot of the product. So worldwide, since 1944, there have been officially 400, almost 450 radiation accidents, and some were sealed sources, some were nuclear, radiation therapy generators, some were isotopes, and there were reactor events, chemical operations, a variety of things that are, happen. So this does happen. This is not just saying like, the boy who cried wolf. These are things that can happen. And they're right in front of us. So you probably saw this in the news over 10 years ago. I guess it's close to 20 years ago when Alexander Litvinenko was a Soviet dissident and or a Russian dissident. Well, he died. He basically fell ill mysteriously in November 2006 when he was in England, and he ultimately died. And it turned out that he somehow ingested a milligram of polonium. It's felt that this was a murder event. Someone had basically got it, and potentially it was he may have been offed by a political system, but he died of a radiation event. Here's the Guyana, Brazil, where they left the cesium source. It was an empty radiation therapy clinic, and basically people took this blue cesium home, and ultimately there were 28 cases of documented radiation sickness. But when the news got out, this is where you also have to be prepared, is over 100,000 people, you created panic. And people were coming in to be screened. They were getting, I don't feel good. I feel weak and dizzy because they all started, getting panicked. And you have to be able to be ready for that. And then they point out when the Soviet Union broke that there were previously approximately 1,000 nuclear generators, but many of them were just like you see right there. They were completely collected for scrap metal, um, broken down, and the radiation disappeared. And also there were radiation injuries that occurred from that. This is one that was surprising to me. In Mexico, there was a radiation therapy device. Again, we know radiation therapy's got a lot of metal, and there was the cobalt 60 was the metal was taken and sold, and the steel was then recycled and used for construction. They found over 200 people exposed, one fatality, four injuries, and they ultimately found over 100 homes had steel from that radiotherapy device that all had to be demolished and brought back to the ground and to restart over for full decontamination. Cobalt 60 lasts for a long time. We also have when we give radiation therapy, we think we're doing the right thing. We trust our radiation therapy. We depend on our physicists, but there have been fatalities, and in the United States as well as across the world, where the radiation therapy device was miscalibrated and led to fatality. What about dirty bombs? Well, again, it makes sense. We had an exercise called Top Off 4 in the United States. There was a simultaneous national exercise that took place between Portland, Oregon, Phoenix, Arizona, and Guam, and where like allegedly there was a phone call came and you have a dirty bomb in your city somewhere. What are you going to do about it? This was a national exercise. 23,000 individuals took part in that exercise. OHSU was front and center, one leading Top Off 4. But what was, again, my written colleagues point out is there already have been two nuclear terrorist events. Fortunately, they have never been led to any negative event where they found a radiation source um, allegedly attributed to Chechen rebels in Moscow where they could find a link to an explosive bomb. The bomb would then release radiation, exposure to the community. Fukushima, we all know about that. A earthquake, a tsunami, and a radiation exposure. Um, Fortunately, the fuel it did shut down. The reactors overheated and melted, but there were casualties, but not to the degree of Chernobyl. But it was also Chernobyl was 10 times the radiation. Was written involved? Well, I can tell you, I remember when that happened because as the written representative, every single day we got reports from written on what was happening in Japan, and the weather, what the situation was, and the United States was ready to take um, individuals if they needed it. But every day we got that we have not been asked to or given indication we needed to accept patients. But, at the time, there were 20 centers ready. We were on the West Coast, we were ready. But fortunately, not enough casualties were required. Fortunately, not enough casualties developed. But the country was ready, the world was ready. I bring this up because this isn't slowed down. Our news, our daily news, brings this forth. 2022, 2 years ago, that was when the Russia went into Ukraine. Well, they also went in and took out they shut down the power, and the nuclear plants fires were out, but they potentially were quite at risk for a disaster because what they showed here, this was ultimately published in September 2022, that that last that last reactor that was active, that they basically had 10 days worth of diesel fuel. The power was shut off to that whole nuclear plant. Ukraine has more nuclear plants than anywhere else in the world. Um, but they had 10 days of diesel fuel for coolant. If they had run out of fuel, there would have been another disaster. That was less than 2 years ago. Um, we have ongoing exercises and threatening, but what about terror scenarios? How real is this? Again, this is information that is out there, but on our day-to-day life, we never really think about. There's a group in the United States called FAST, the Federation of American Scientists. They formed themselves after World War II and the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you can go on their website, but they keep a list. They keep a track of all the available global, you know, the inventories. And we're aware of it, but I will point out you guys are surrounded by it. Fortunately, nothing's going on, but you have it in your neighborhood. So being prepared is the right thing to do. A lot of those stockpiles are retired. The light gray is retired. Some of our, you know, deployed non-strategic, but you can see between the Russia and the United States, that deep red, there are over 3,000 warheads that are active in strategic warheads that could be a problem. This came out in 2023. They were saying, you know what, if we ever got hit, the United States, it'll happen in potentially six cities. Um, they actually looked at, this was an old map where they matched the use of nuclear weapons to take out the 1,100 nuclear silos, the U.S. missile silos, and all the radiation fallout that would happen if you did that, if that ever happened. But ultimately, it would hit 75% of people in all these zones that are shown would be killed. And there's the radiation exposure. This is literally was just 2 days ago or 3 days ago. This showed up on U.S. News that, again, it's planning what would happen if nuclear events did occur and all the war stuff that's happening. This escalates. Well, here's what would happen in New York: 15 million, 1.5 million dead, 3 million casualties. I mapped it to Oregon, to Portland. You can map your own city here. I could tell you that every major hospital in Portland would be eliminated by this, by an event. So the news keeps happening. We see it. It's there every day. And this one came out in April, with when there was some discussion of escalation, when Russia was talking about what would happen if Ukraine was allowed into NATO. Well, nuclear war, if it happened, could take out a lot of Europe. These are just negative. I mean, this is just collected, and I don't mean to sound negative, but I'm saying this is what's in the United States. We are trained now to be aware that this is a possibility and maybe even the likelihood, but we need to be prepared. Now, military weapons are probably not going to happen. We think the strategic arms, protection is going to prevent military level weapons to get across. What they're worried about is what's called the terrorist device. Hiroshima was about the uranium used for Hiroshima was 10 to 15 kiloton. For Nagasaki, that was plutonium. That was about 20 kiloton. Well, if you all saw the movie Oppenheimer, you saw how big those bombs were. Right now, it's estimated that a 10 kiloton bomb can fit in a suitcase. And that is what the U.S. is being prepared for. And a lot of the models are what would happen if you have a 10 kiloton explosion. You could see that pretty much in the epicenter, you would have devastation, but that's a half a mile. But if you get to 3 miles, you still would have a lot of damage. But the fallout that comes afterward is where you're going to have significant injury. So they actually mapped in the original 2004, 2005 workbook, they mapped Washington, D.C., center of our government. Half a mile would be pressure thermal damage and local radiation, but there'd be over 20 miles. Now look at the numbers. If this is over 400 REM exposure, 200,000 fatal casualties, 180,000 fatalities, but there's only 40,000 hospital beds in the United States. How do we handle 200,000 non-fatal casualties? That's what led to the national preparedness effort. We know about radiation. What happens if you use, so everything in the United States is based on a 10 kiloton model. Okay, 63,000 casualties early from a 10 kiloton bomb. These are patients that'll be more local. The mild is going to be, which is the local radiation. These patients they will be able to recover on their own, but they still will be panicked, and they actually may be evacuated. So all of this is just part of the scenario. So here's what happens in casualty. 85% will have trauma or burn and receive treatment elsewhere. This is for me in written. 15% in the United States is predicted to be radiation only. By the way, this effort in the United States was led by Norm Coleman. He was a radiation therapist who moved to the NIH and ran the radiation biology session and also led the United States efforts. He died last year, but I think his contribution to this field, is enormous, and we should I've just recognized Norm Coleman for his contribution. So we think that 15% will be distributed, and then you could see of that 15%, 30% may require inpatient care, 70% may be low enough to say, you know what, we think we can handle you outpatient. We can give you antiemetics, we can watch your blood counts drop and watch it come back. Importantly, we're transplanters. It is a tiny fraction of people that's expected will ever go to transplant. We will be treating radiation injury. We will not be treating, we will not be transplanting per se, but we're going to still take up a lot of hospital beds in the care delivery. So again, how do you model a 10,000, a 10 kiloton bomb? There's your radiation with trauma, 35,000 cases, 30,000 burns, radiation only, 400,000 people. Now, this is where it gets sobering. How do you handle it? It's easy to talk about numbers, but you start to think about the logistics. 650,000 people will need will need some sort of emergency response, of which a third or 270,000 will need high-level medical care. Hospital admissions, 240,000. Maybe half of them, 110, 100, even maybe to 2/3, will need to be transferred. 260,000 deaths, and then now it gets now you have even closer logistics. Who needs pain meds? 20,000 I'll be able to give oral oxycodone to, or oral, some oral, maybe morphine. It's estimated that parenteral IV narcotics, for the burn, for the trauma, can be 225,000 patients, which means, do we have the people to take care of that? And then you have the radiation exposure. What happens? So 1,500, these patients are all dead. 800 to 1,500, they probably almost all going to die. We might be able to save some of the 500, 800. Most of these patients will be savable, but they're still going to need, emergent care of some form. What do we look for? We look for nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, disorientation, and headache. Anxiety will be, stress level on everybody. But I'll tell you, disorientation and headache, if you see that early, that is without a doubt, there's no survivors. They all die. And so it's in this group that we're going to look to implement care. And so I've identified, again, in that same 10 kiloton event, we need 45,000 doses of morphine. We need 175,000 IV antiemetics. Low modal, Imodium, we need 100,000 doses of antidiarrheals. Cytokines, 60,000. ICU care. What type of radiation? What are we talking about? We're really talking, there's alpha, beta, gamma to remind you. Gamma is what we're really talking about. Alpha, beta is going to be not really, it's going to cause maybe some potential local burn, but it's not going to be what, is the big push. We know that someone who gets alpha, you could actually just change their clothes, wash them, shower them down, and there's a good chance you'll have gotten rid of a lot of the external contamination. You always have to be aware, though, your food supply. We have a food supply, and that if it gets in, and this is what they dealt with in Chernobyl when they looked at some of the, where they did big agriculture, they had to shut down a lot of the land because you grow food and then it could continue to expose people. How do you protect yourself if you're exposed? Get as far away as you can, limit the time you're exposed, but most important is use shielding. And what we'll tell you is go to the basement, because depending on how close you are, you will automatically be shielded just by the ground. And so, like I said, I'm probably older than most of you on this call, and I grew up in a town that built most of the nuclear subs. And we actually had a high school project is to take three, 10, or 5 kiloton bombs and take out, see how we can do the greatest amount of damage to take out Connecticut. So I was doing this back in the 7th grade, but this is what we learned. No, that's not really helpful. So what is acute radiation syndrome? Well, the LD50 is the lethal, that's the lethal dose at 50%, is going to be, if you do no supportive care, is 3.5 to 4 gray. If you have antibiotics, blood products, and other supportive care, maybe growth factors, up to 7 gray can survive. Between 7 and 10 gray, maybe we could keep those alive with a transplant. Shielding will help. By the way, the beautiful, beautiful research work coming out that if you even shield, they've done some work in primates. If you shield, 50% of the femur and you give total body radiation to the rest of the primate, that shielded bone marrow will be enough to actually autologously reconstitute an individual. We look for acute skin, blood, neurovascular, and GI, and the presentation all depends on the dose. And what we have now are awareness. We have awareness of how fast they occur. And it turns out this is really critical to know, because when you know exactly when an event happens. But if you could figure out how many hours or how many days before you have a symptom, you can then almost estimate the radiation dose. This is one of the biodosimetries. If I know how fast somebody after exposure is vomiting, I can predict how many gray they saw and whether or not that person is going to be salvageable or not. And so again, your nausea could be mild to excruciating. Your vomiting could be once a day, could be 10 times a day. These data are important to record, because that will help define, how I'm going to treat a patient. And this is same with headache and neurologic deficits, same with GI symptoms, same with skin symptoms. So here is somebody had exposure to a 30 hours after radiation. You could see edematous hand, erythema. They go in onto blister, and ultimately, this was the radiation source. I think this was Guyana, the one in Brazil, when the people handled that blue stone that they found. You could see people were blistering. People had, if I remember correctly, this picture here was someone put the cesium in their back pocket, and this was the gluteal, um, hamstring ulceration lesion that led to necrosis and ultimately required massive surgery. So again, what we're going to do is be aware that on the blood syndrome, we can actually measure blood counts, and we know this. We do this every day. We give someone a product, we watch their counts. What we do know is now you can look at platelets, you can look at neutrophils, but lymphocytes is turned out to be one of the most sensitive measures of radiation exposure. And so that is what's going to be built into a written site. We're going to be, when patients come, we will even potentially have a CB. If we know this is happening, we get a call that 70 patients are arriving at the airport. We don't know what their exposure is, but we'll have a CBC machine at the airport, and we can actually quickly do our best to figure out by biodosimetry, what their dose exposure was. We can ask them quickly how many times a day you're vomiting. We can do a quick check of their lymphocyte count, and there's now tools that will allow you to quickly measure and estimate the exposure, because that's going to estimate how you're going to treat them. There's some beautiful work coming out with proteomics that they presented at the meeting, last week or 2 weeks ago, where there's a device that you could just basically do a diabetic pinprick. That on your serum, they can actually look for proteins that are released after cellular damage, and so you can actually put together thousands of people. It's even much greater number of patients than a CBC could get. So Time to vomiting, again, similar biodosimetry. It can tell you who's salvageable, who's not. Same thing across the absolute lymphocyte. From the time of exposure, what is your lymphocyte count? If it's 24 hours and your lymphocyte count is 0, you know that you've got a major radiation exposure. I'm, you know, yeah, here's 6th grade. If it's like 6 hours afterward, your count's 0. You know, down here, yeah, here's the low count. And so the higher the lymphocyte count, the less the radiation exposure. So the absolute lymphocyte count is now felt to be one of the most critical measures that we can use for protection. You can see Norm Coleman led that effort. This is a new combined software device that can actually look at mixed symptoms with presumed exposure, which agent you got, and then will tell you what agent and how to treat the person, what type of intervention can be scheduled by this simple tool. Um, so these are now available. By the way, all these websites, you'll be, if you're interested in this, you can go and play these websites and pursue these websites and learn more on your own, because it's felt that this is not information that should be proprietary. This is information that needs to be distributed across health systems so we can be prepared. Um, as I said, the other thing that the government's aware of is, if this happens, we really want to know, you know, ultimately, we want to learn from it. So if it ever happens again, we can be better prepared. And so using the National Marrow Donor Program, because they're going to be very heavily linked to HLA typing and helping us through it in the United States, they've created a protocols and consent forms that, as we're managing patients with radiation syndrome, acute radiation syndrome, we'll be collecting data, and that can be used in the future, not for real time, but for the future. So what's new for the next group? For mitigation and treatment, what can we do? Well, this is what to expect. If there's a radiation event happens, they're going to do whatever they can on the borders, on the fringe of that event, to do emergency decontamination and local care, local trauma, local burns will be treated. They'll do what they call technical decontamination, ingestion. So if you've had iodine exposure, radioactive, they can give you, a blocking agent. There's a number of these things you can do. Actually, if you've ingested something, they want to do decorporation. They may want to have you evacuate your bowels just to get the radiation out of you because it's inside you. You breathe it in, you ingest it. But once you're sort of stabilized, then um, the written and the U.S. government and all the non-governmental transport will take place. It will go to um, this is the national disaster, units. You go to trauma hospitals, burn hospitals, and written hospitals, and there's where we will do our best to manage the casualties. And it won't be instantaneous. They recognize that we would anticipate continuous delivery of casualties over a 1 to 2 to 3 week period. And they will come by plane. We will be notified. We'll have short notice, but our job, like we're the written hospital, but there's many other hospitals. We will then integrate with our hospital networks across the state, and my team can be sitting down and talking to a hospital 100 miles away saying, you're going to get someone who had 500, 500 rads of exposure, 500 centigrade. We think they need growth factors only. You may need antidiarrheals, antiemetics, but we think in 7 or 8 days they'll be ready for outpatient. They need antibiotics. You can take care of them. Call us if you need us. And so we're going to use those communities, and we are going to coordinate, but we're going to basically we'll be distributing our knowledge to those around us. And again, this is the kind of things they have in the webs based on your dosage. Do you need prophylactic antibiotics? Do you need cytokines? These maps and these guides are all available. Blood products, that'll be great. The problem is blood products will be in short supply. You got to collect a blood product, and you have to have a healthy group of people. Can you get there? That will be a limited. We already know blood products are limiting. Antibiotics are going to be needed. Growth factors. The FDA has already approved multiple growth factors for the acute radiation syndrome. GCSF, long-acting pegylated GCSF, GM-CSF, most recently Ramaplastin. They've all been approved by the FDA for in the event of acute radiation syndrome. Decorporation agents, they will use toxicology to help figure out how to get the particular um, isotope best treated. And like I said, there's going to be these resources the government are providing that will help you understand what to do. FEMA, how do you have a national stockpile? Well, we do have these regional stockpiles, and this is a picture of one of these of I was sent of what's in the stockpile. I have no clue where it is, but like we've had where it was most famous, we had a major hurricane that flooded and took out most of New Orleans. A lot of the people had to relocate. They were living in the Houston Astrodome, the football stadium, but they activated the stockpile. This stockpile has IV solutions, plasticware. They have ventilators. They use the stockpile ventilators during COVID, but they have to constantly refill the stockpile. There are growth factors in the stockpile. There are antibiotics. There are antiemetics. It's all there. Um, as far as transplant, we're almost done with this whole presentation, by the way. Um, it's going to be a minority of patient population. There will be some that will have sustained aplasia. What's our likelihood of having a donor? Well, it's going to be small. What we're going to do is, and the other thing is, these patients are going to be disseminated from their family. So you could say, I want their family member to come and do a haplo. Well, the fact is, I don't know how to find their family member. Their family member is somewhere else, or they don't even know where their family member is. And so what we want to do is come up with other models. And so we are looking at mechanisms for rapid, class HLA class typing, of which you can do emergent transplants. So this was recorded from my from Nelson Chow, who was the first, was just one, actually, he's been at Duke, the transplant director at Duke for years. He was just awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by Written for his efforts over the 25 years. This is when you actually look at the number of all these radiation injuries that we talk about, there's actually only 40 patients have been transplanted. Most of them were after Chernobyl. There was only 4 known survivors. They were all autologous recovery. In this case, the graft that was given in a way was a booster graft while you wait for autologous recovery. But we're going to worry about graft versus host. And you could see 25% of patients, they were rapidly done. The HLA typing may not have been perfect, but they died of GVHD. How do we consider, like I said, who gets a transplant? If you see someone who's got a neutrophil count of under 100 at day 6, that's a candidate. Using those biodosimetry, if you have rapid loss of platelets and lymphocytes, they may be somebody. If they're aplastic or you have evidence of marrow necrosis, after 2 weeks, maybe you should think about transplant. If you think your radiation dose is 5 to 10 gray, you could think about it. Over 10 gray, they're probably not going to survive. They're going to die of organ damage. When we say that we give fractionated radiation at 12 to 14 gray and it's well tolerated, 1560, I think, was the highest in the past. That was fractionated. When you get single dose 1200, your organs aren't going to survive. So the dosimetry estimates are also critical. Making sure that you don't have, significant burns or organ dysfunction that's going to lead to a patient. These will help guide it. You can quickly do HLA typing through a buccal swab. You can now do DNA-based techniques. The NMDP thinks that they can do 10,000 typings a week. So if we can identify those patients and somehow the transport system will let us get our samples to the NMDP, they're going to be prepared to ramp up, and they're going to use regional laboratories to helpfully do the typing, and they will get the data out as fast as possible. And of course, they'll use international registry searches. You know, they'll say it's aplastic anemia. Well, you've got it. You don't have to give you anything. You know, we just have to make sure you don't reject. So it's just no myeloablation. Um, you know, you just have to get some immune suppression to get the engraftment. Maybe all you need the engraftment is to get autologous recovery, but you just need something there. You need GVHD prophylaxis that's going to avoid mucosal toxicity. Um, they do think that ultimately haplo or, you know, parent to child will be useful. We think that the new data and the new approach will help. You guys are well aware of that. You're doing it. Um, but we're now finding, you know, there's some national studies in the United States optimizing haplo regimens for aplastic anemia, where the oldest patients on the trial are now 75. But in a way, that's our training ground for what to do in these sort of events. So, in summary, as I said, this is a lightning presentation in whatever I am, 50 minutes, more than you ever want to know, more than you ever hopefully have to know. But just to say, if it's anything, it's reassuring that if an event happens, people are prepared and people are prepared to help across the world. We do think radiation events can occur in a variety of scenarios. We know that we are the ones that will be front and center to help assist to guide the care. We all think about the emergency room, we think about the surgeons, but once you get past that first 6 to 12 hours, it's on us to deliver the care, and everybody's going to be involved. It's going to be physicians, it's going to be nurses and nurses' aides. Everybody is going to be dealing with this. One of those scenarios is okay, we've got these patients that have arrived. We've now tripled our need for, you know, to deliver radiation injury. We know, what do we know? We know it's going to take them 25 days to, you know, to recover. Do we have enough personnel to handle that? Am I going to be on call 14 straight days? Probably. But I mean, that's the reality that we don't have the staff, but we have to be prepared to think about this. That's what this exercise is, to make sure that we're ready to train others. As far as you, for you guys, these are some of the, you can go on written. A lot of the slides I take, they've prepared a grand rounds, and I've used their grand rounds, and I've added a lot of my own stuff. But I showed you this. It's a sanctioned, approved grand rounds for treatment of radiation injury that Written has provided. They have guidelines and protocols. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has their Radiation Emergency Medical Management, the REM group. They also have a website that will help you. There's resources. If you want to even know more, you can download some very detailed documents that will um, help you understand how to deal with this if this ever does happen. I believe this is Hiroshima after the event. And finally, just for interest, this is my favorite educational book I think I've read over the last 2 years. Is if you all haven't seen the movie Oppenheimer, that talks about Los Alamos. Well, Hanford is actually, which is on the Oregon-Washington border, that's where they develop plutonium. And it turns out uranium, even though we make a lot of discussion of uranium, uranium is very hard to purify. And if the nuclear race depended on uranium, there wouldn't have been a nuclear race. Plutonium is very easy. And this is the nuclear reactors that are on the Columbia River. And there's most of them are closed down, dismantled. One is still a National Historic Monument that you can go visit. But this was Steve Olson was a reporter for the Seattle Times, and he went out and basically told the story of plutonium and how Hanford came about. Honestly, there was absolutely nothing there. The government realized the Columbia River had enough water to cool the reactors. And what they did is they hired a workforce to build a city. They built a city that could house the workforce, and then they built the reactor. So 200,000 people were moved into basically high altitude desert to build the reactors that led to plutonium manufacture, purification, and ultimately launched the arms race. So, to all of you,